Tēnā rā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou I tēnei rā. Kauraki te maunga, kua take te awa no o Amaru aho, engari no orewa, toko kāinga I nāianei, no ko te rana o ko tipuna, ko Bruce Rawa, ko Robertson, o ko whānau, ko Judy Bruce, toko ingoa. Been in education for a very long time, actually my whole life. And my early days, I was youth working and teaching. I was youth working with some people in this room, Danny Abraham, Gwyn John, Lynn Jensen's husband, Chris Jensen. And during that time, I was working at the intersections of youth development and education. I still am. And what I noticed was that there was this miscommunication between young people in the way they talk to the teachers and the teachers the way they talk to the young people, and especially akonga Māori. And I noticed that their sense of humour was often mistaken as being cheeky, and they would have a joke with the teacher and the teacher would misunderstand them, and then they get told off and the relationships disintegrated basically. And so I guess what's at my heart is this ethical question about what does it mean to be in ethical relationship with people who are different to ourselves. And by different, I mean those who come from radically different backgrounds to ourselves or culturally different backgrounds to ourselves. And it seems to becoming, it's always been an important question, but I think it's becoming increasingly important globally and nationally. And so in New Zealand, we're at this, I think, a really critical point in moving conversations forward around racism, bias and discrimination in a way that could lead to incredible depth of understanding with each other, or it could create a separatist kind of space that we see happening globally. One thing that I just wanted to say though is that, just as I'd written in the blurb about today, it's that what we see is that increasingly the Ministry of Education and increasingly in government policy that is naming explicitly racism, discrimination and bias in a way that I think we haven't seen before in education. And I know that educators want to get it right, but we're often frozen for fear of getting it wrong. So what do we do in this space? And that's really what I want to unpack today, especially as leaders. How do we lead in this space that open up dialogue for ethical relationship? As I said before, one of the things that interests me the most is about relationship, what it means to be in relationship. And there's a reason why, and I want to share this with you if you haven't seen it before. It's a way of understanding a system and a way of understanding systems change, and I find it really helpful. So what we see, this is from the model, The Waters of Systems Change, is that there are 6 conditions that hold a system in place. And so these are policy, practice, resource flow, relationships and power dynamics, and mental models. That's our beliefs. And so what we see is a ministry shift, or an intensification of direction, and also starting to see it in schools as well, where there is increasingly more attention being given to policy around addressing racism, bias and discrimination, and te tiriti or waitangi practices especially, and policy around honouring that and exploring what that means, and also addressing resource flow, so putting more resource in there. And they're like what we call structural change. So to see a shift happen in a system, you need to shift one of these conditions at a time, or preferably eventually all of these conditions would shift. If you shift these conditions, the system will change. And so in the middle system, you see the relational changes that need to happen. So what are the relationships and connections and power dynamics that hold a system in place, and what are the areas that need to change when you think about relationships and connections and power dynamics? If you think of your learning organisation or your organisation as its own ecosystem, you can begin to think about what are the relationships and connections and power dynamics that need to shift in order to change to reach that goal that you want to get to. But what I find really interesting is the mental models, it's the beliefs, because I think this is arguably the most difficult work, and it's really what they call transformative change. And this is the interesting work that I guess we're all here to explore today. It means, what are the conditions? How do we create shifts in people's beliefs, or how do we invite people into thinking otherwise, in this instance around racism, bias and discrimination? So I have a framework for thinking about this, and I want to share that with you today. So it's in response to this question, what does it mean to be an ethical relationship with people different to ourselves? Now, sociologists call this the other, meaning one who is radically different to ourselves or very different to ourselves, or the stranger even. So the one that is not like us. And so there's 4 ways that we can think about this. So I'm going to share the first 3, and then we'll look at the last one. Okay. So when we think about relating to people who are very different to ourselves, we typically hear one of 3 responses. Okay. The first one is an exclusionary response. You are different to us. You are not welcome here. And we hear that in global rhetoric overseas, but we also hear that in New Zealand. We hear that in our schools. So, for example, a student who is struggling, we might hear teachers say, he has the problem, it's not us, it's not my teaching. And that student is so difficult and challenging, let's exclude that student, they are not welcome here. And so that is one of the 4 ways that we think about being in relationship with people not like ourselves. It's often the fear or the demonization of the stranger. And there's a sociologist called Bowman that I really am inspired by. He uses the term anthropoemic, which means to vomit out the other or vomit out the stranger, which is quite a graphic way of thinking about it. Often exclusion is a response to real or perceived harm. The second one is inclusion. It says, you are welcome here as long as you become like us. And I know we use exclusion a lot, and I'm just using, I'm problematizing, I'm troubling that term today, just to say this is a way of thinking about being in relationship with people different to ourselves. But in actual fact, it's actually quite a lot like assimilation, because it says, you are welcome here so long as you change. Like the system that we have, the schooling system, for example, that we have, it largely works. So you are welcome here, but you just need to change to fit into it. And so we adapt existing systems to accommodate for people who are different to ourselves, but the system still largely stays the same. And this is what, if those of you that follow Anne Milne's work, when she talks about, for example, culturally responsive pedagogy as opposed to culturally sustaining pedagogy, that's what she's talking about. She's saying, like, largely we think this is a liberal system that works pretty well and we just need to make a few changes, but the system remains in place. The third way of thinking about people different to ourselves is to think about celebration. So this is what we see often as well, and we hear the words of let's celebrate difference, let's celebrate diversity, you be you, I'll be me, and let's learn from each other. And this is often comes from a critical justice position. It's saying, like, for example, in schools we celebrate different cultures, or in cities we have like Festival of Light or something like this. We celebrate by, for example, learning about other people's culture, other people's food, visiting other places, and this is all it's a welcome to say, yeah, let's celebrate you as you are, and I will stay as I am. The difference, the may arguably what happens in all 3 of these spaces, and I'm just using this as a framework to make a point, okay? We can pull it apart later, but actually you can pull it apart soon in the breakout rooms. But largely, this is holding power in place, okay? So for example, if we're thinking about racism, the white core remains the center. This holds the structure or the system in place for any of these, because the majority or the majority culture, because the majority culture isn't disrupted or interrupted in any way. So which takes us to, what does it mean for transformative relationship? What does it mean for that transformative shift to happen in our mental models and our belief systems? So transformation is a fourth way. It's saying, you have something important to teach me about what it means to be in the world. And when you teach me, it is an altering encounter. It's a disruption to my stable sense of self. So for those of you that follow the work of Gert Biester, for example, he's a really well-known educational theorist. He explains it like this: when we celebrate cultures, we learn from cultures. But when we enter into ethical relationship in a way that disrupts our core beliefs, there's a destabilization that happens. And so it's a challenge to our core beliefs in a way that shifts our actions and our ways of being. So these are the 4 different ways of thinking about being in the world. So we're going to go back into breakouts. You'll be in the same room, so you don't have to introduce yourselves again. But what I'd like you to do is to think about in what ways do the 4 different views provide a tool for thinking about the elephants in your room. And share a time when you have had a destabilizing encounter with someone or that created a different way of thinking or being. I guess the second part to this kaupapa that I want to explore today is, as leaders, how do we foster ethical relationships with others? If the idea is to be open to the possibility that somebody has something to teach us about what it means to be in the world, and if that means that is going to in some way destabilize or shift the way I think about being in the world, then how do we foster that? That's kind of the direction that we seek to go. So I want to share with you 3 key ideas around this. There are 3 ways that I think about being and ways of knowing or not knowing. And I'll unpack each one. The first one is the idea of getting comfortable with not knowing, which is actually really hard for us as leaders, as education leaders, and those who, look to us in some instances as experts. It's just a recognition that our knowledge is actually only partial. And so I'm going to unpack what that means. The second thing is getting comfortable with vulnerability, and in particular, humility, and exploring the idea of humility, because we really don't talk about that a lot in education either. And the third one is getting comfortable with complexity and sometimes complicity, meaning that, we are going to cause harm, and that let's have honest conversations about that too. So we'll start looking at the first one, which is the partiality of knowledge, or the partiality of knowing. So I like to use 3 different pictures. They're from Open Spaces for Dialogue and Education to explain what this means. So the first one is that we all come with carrying backpacks, and these have in them our experiences, our cultural backgrounds, our beliefs, and they are something that we don't take off. We carry around with us everywhere we go, and we use them as our filters. And so in that way, what's in our backpack shapes the way that we see the world. So if you look at the second image, do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? So what this image means is that whatever is in our backpacks shapes our worldview. And so somebody looks at one thing in one way and somebody looks at it in another way. We both see different things. The idea about the partiality of knowledge is this third one. It's a principle for Open Spaces for Dialogue and Education, and it says that all knowledge can be questioned. Okay, so we all carry with us a partial view of the world, and none of us know the whole completeness of that, of what the world contains. So that's why I quite like this image here. It speaks to the partiality of knowledge. So this man's looking up into the galaxy. He sees some stars that he knows. He sees a whole lot that he doesn't know. Nobody has complete knowledge of that. We all have partiality of knowledge. And so there's another way of thinking about this, which I really love, and it's by a poet called Rumi. You may or may not have heard of him. And he says these words: out beyond ideas of wrong doing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And I love this because I think it really speaks to the partiality of knowledge. And what we mean by that is that there's basically like a continuum. So you can have universalism, which is universalism says there is a right way of knowing and being in the world, and there is a wrong way of knowing and being in the world. Absolute relativism on the other end of the continuum says anything goes, you do you, I'll be me, and what works for you, that's fine. What works for anyone else, that's fine. But ethical relationship is this middle space. So out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. It says it's difficult and everything is context dependent. None of us have total knowledge about any one thing. We all come with different perspectives. So in the messiness of that, let's come, let's sit, and let's talk together. So this is the idea of getting comfortable with not knowing. The second thing that I love about this image is a humility. And I think that the two go hand in hand. This idea of the partiality of knowledge and also of a humility. And I also think of it as about getting comfortable with vulnerability. In fact, when we start to connect with people who are radically different to ourselves, often what I hear people say is that it's awkward. There is an awkwardness because we have this fear of getting it wrong. We often do get it wrong. We talk past each other. Emotions get high. And also, it's a not knowing how to be in a space. If you think of a time when you've been in a space, in a community with people who are really different to yourselves, it's the not knowing what's normative. And that can feel disruptive and awkward. And the humility that comes in those kind of spaces can really open us up to being taught by people in a way that wouldn't otherwise happen. The other thing about vulnerability, it's an allowing us, creating a space that allows for mistakes, and it really requires a ton of grace. The people that I see that do open up spaces for dialogue and educational dialogue around kaupapa like this and cultural difference are people who are incredibly gracious and who make way for learning, make way for mistakes. I think also around humility, I think about the surfacing of the reality of our own complicity in causing harm. So as an educator, I have most of my life worked in alternative education. I think when I think really critically about alternative education, I think that in advocating for that, I have been complicit in causing harm because for a whole lot of reasons I can't get into right now. But it's just saying the work we do when we're seeking to engage in this space, there is a complicity, and it's just an acknowledgement of that. Somebody talked the other day about the difference between relief and transformation, and he was saying that there is, as we work towards transformation, there's also the need to create relief in a place. And I was thinking again back to that continuum of Anne Milne's that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that where it talks about shifting from culturally responsive to culturally sustaining or critically sustaining. So a lot of schools are in the culturally responsive place, and in a way it's like relief while transformation happens. And so again, it's just about having some grace around meeting people where they're at, and but having that vision of transformation and where we want to head to. The other thing I want to say about humility is and this idea of being taught by the other is that it is only a welcome. We can stand open to the possibility that the other might teach us something about what it means to be in the world that's different, but we can't force it. And so I've heard, sometimes I've heard education leaders, for example, talking about mana whenua engagement and being frustrated by some of the things that have happened or have not happened, and just this kind of expectation like it's a right, but it's not a right to know. It's just a standing and a being open and a humility that we may come to know or may not come to know. I hope that makes sense. It's quite hard to say in a short period of time. The final thing that I wanted just to talk about was getting comfortable with complexity, and sometimes complicity. So with regards to this, is what I mean is that our natural disposition, especially in education, I think, is to want a straightforward path, because we're so busy and things are already pretty complex in the systems that we work. So we want the uncomplicated. But when being in ethical relationship or learning to foster ethical relationships, it's impossible to avoid complexity. And so it's learning to become comfortable with that. An academic that I've worked with in the past, who's actually my PhD supervisor, Vanessa Andriotti, she talks about the idea of learning to travel together differently on a rocky road, meaning a rocky road is not a straightforward path. We will trip over, we will stumble, we will get it wrong, but it's learning how can we travel together on that rocky road. The final point around complexity, getting comfortable with complexity, is just an acknowledgement of historical and political understandings of culture and power. If we are seeking to have conversations that don't acknowledge the historical or the political complexities of culture and power, then we're not really able to wrestle enough with the complexity of any situation. I really just wanted to finish on one more whakaaro, I guess, and it's from the sociologist I was speaking about earlier today, and it's talking about the idea of the stranger, the unsettling nature of being in relationship with people different to ourselves. And I find this really inspiring. I'll read it and then I'll explain. So strangers make obscure what ought to be transparent. They confuse what ought to be straightforward. They pollute the joy with anxiety, befog and clips the boundary lines, gestate uncertainty. So if we can get comfortable with the uncomfortable and be mindful that the journey we're on is a disruptive journey to our ways of being, and I would say in New Zealand, in education, this is a disruptive journey, particularly towards our ways of being in Te Tiriti honouring spaces, and also in creating openness to diversity in broadest forms. Then this is the journey that we're going on. This is a rocky road journey that that Vanessa Andriotti speaks about as well. So I'm leaving you on that messiness note, and I just say that the journey that we're on is a courageous journey, and it does require a ton of grace. And if we can lead in education spaces and model that, then I think that will take our community as a whole a long way towards the aspirations that we have. Nō reira, tēnā rā koutou katoa.